Well, I thought I'd make a video to help you hopefully do some last minute preparations for the AP test. There are lots of things you can do on my website. Uh, so let's first talk about the multiple choice part of the test. Since you've all taken the final and seen the kind of questions you're going to be dealing with on the AP test, you'll notice that there's going to be a lot of reading and tracing of code. So the best way to get faster at that is just to keep practicing it and keep doing problems. Um, so I've got tons of problems linked to here that you can practice from, and I encourage all of you, if you've got some extra time, to go through and do that. If you've got prep books too, they kind of have good lists of concepts that are important in the course, but I think kind of at this point you don't need to review so much concepts as you do need to practice tracing code. I think that's going to be where you're going to find the most trouble getting through the exam. So if we kind of skip over the multiple choice part, then the thing that's probably going to be more important to talk about is the free response part. So there are lots of things on here that you can do to get ready for the free response. The most important of which I think is to go and actually do free response questions. And so this link here on my website will take you to the AP website, and in a minute I'll go there with you and show you, some old free response questions and walk through them with you. This video here is a review of kind of AP Computer Science in 45 minutes, so if you'd like just a quick rundown of topics, you can do that. If you want a checklist of the different topics that you should be able to do, you can look at that as well. This link here is to the quick reference guide that you had on the final, which you'll also have in the AP test. In this document, which I will open up, important things to remember is a document I've made a couple years back where I go through some things that might be of use to you to remember. So let's see if I can zoom in on this. Maybe it's not gonna let me. Let me hide the sidebar. Oh, there we go. So it's sort of like this is a cheat sheet of topics. So how do you create an array? How do you create an array list? How do you create a 2D array? The operations you do with each. There's more operations on arrays, array lists, and 2D arrays. Operations on strings here could be useful because strings are usually a big topic on the AP test. Boolean operators, and something called short circuit evaluation, how integer operations work, important math functions to know, the differences between references and values in terms of how objects work and how ints work would be a good thing to look at and review. Things about how classes are set up, some of the rules, static versus non-static, some recursion examples, sorts, searches, and how this and super work, as well to some strategies that I've put here at the end. So if you were to look at this document, I think it would be worth your time too. But what I really want to kind of spend time talking to you about is this link here to past free response questions. So here you can see all the past free response questions that have ever been used for AP Computer Science, at least back to about 2003. There was AP Computer Science before then in C++ and in Pascal, but they don't have those posted. 2015 I showed you in class. If you want to know how the actual answers were supposed to look and how they were graded, they have this thing called the scoring guidelines. They also have sample responses that shows you what other students have done and what they were scored. So I'm going to show you the 2014 free response questions and talk a little bit about kind of what we got here. So the first question is a strings question, and that's one of the major topics you should expect in a free response is something to do with strings. And you can read through this more on your own, but one thing you want to look at always is that they give you an example. So here they said we're supposed to finish a method called Scramble Word. It takes a word here like tan, abracadabra, whoa, aardvark, eggs, and a, or an empty string, and it scrambles it in some way. And the rules are given here. There are 3 rules. The scrambling process always goes from left to right, starting from the first letter. And if 2 consecutive letters consist of an A followed by a not an A, then the 2 letters are swapped in the resulting string. The third rule actually doesn't end up mattering that much if you follow the first 2, but it also says that if 2 letters are involved in a swap, then you would never swap those letters a part of any other swap. And following the first 2 rules doesn't ever imply that if you follow the first 2 rules, the third rule doesn't matter. I guess they just add that for clarification purposes. They say write your solutions on the next page, and then they give you this. What this tells you is that you have a method to finish, and they give you some things that you should know. So precondition here says you should know that the word parameter here is either an empty string or contains only uppercase letters. Well, that's great to know. The post conditions are really just kind of a reiteration of what the directions above said. These are the things that you need to do. So I'm going to switch over to Eclipse now, and we're going to try to write this first method, the Scramble Word method. So there's kind of lots of ways to do this, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to so there's two strategies. Let me talk about that first. So once essentially what you want to do is you either want to go through and slice up the word and replace whatever you want. If we had AB, if we had TAR, tar, what we could do is tarp, there we go. So essentially we need the A and the R to switch in this word. So one way to do that is to take the first letter, take the second letter, take the third letter, take the fourth letter, and kind of rearrange them on the fly. Another way to do it is to kind of build a string, which I think is the easier way to do it. And if I have time here, I think I might do it both ways. So here's what I think is the easier way. So I'm going to make a string called answer, which I'm going to initialize as the empty string. And then I'm going to go through every position in the word. It'd be a good idea to know, as Eclipse is locking up, that strings have a length method. And what I'd like to do is take out the next letter. I think I could do a substring, from the string. And that would be a good command to know. The substring command from a position to the one after it will take out one letter. And essentially we want to know what happens, what is this letter. So if next is equal to, so remember that's how you do string comparisons, the letter A, then that means we're potentially doing a swap. Now what's funny is if the rule is if the first letter is an A and the letter after it is an A, you're not supposed to swap them. But if you did, it doesn't really matter if you swap them because they're the same. So here is where the second rule, if you follow it exactly, then the third rule you don't need. So let's say you have AAD. So this string should become ADA. And the reason why is because the first A is not followed by another A, we ignore it. But when we look at the second A, it's followed with a D, we swap them. The way students were getting this wrong is they would swap these two A's and think that since this second A was already part of a swap, that you wouldn't swap it with the D. So we do need to check to see if the one afterwards, if that one is going to be a different letter or not. So the problem with that is we also have to make sure that there is a letter afterwards. So I'm going to break this into cases like if I is not equal to word.length minus 1, because that means I'm not at the end of it. If I'm not at the end of it, then I want to get the letter afterwards. Substring from, this would be from I plus 1 to I plus 2. And I can check if the after one is equal to A or not. So at this point, I've already written a lot of code. This one, I remember this was one that was not a fun one to grade because it took a lot to make it work right. So what I've got here is if I've got a letter A and if the letter after it is not an A, then I need to do a swap. And here's how I'm going to do the swap. I'm just going to add to the end of the answer string after plus next. So notice I've just switched their order. That's the hardest part of this. Now we have to go through kind of our other cases. So here's the else case. What if, so this essentially means I have an A followed by an A. Well, if I have an A followed by an A, all I want to do is add to the answer string the letter A. Now, what I also need to do up here, which I just glossed over, is because I've just done a swap and I've processed two strings, I also need to do another I++, because I don't want to process the letter that I just swapped with, which would be the A. So it's a little bit confusing, but at this point, I think we're in good shape. Now we have to have an else to this one too, which is what if I have an A and the one after it doesn't exist because I'm at the end? Well, if I'm an A and there's nothing after it, then I shouldn't do a swap, so I just need to add A after myself. Looking good. Now for the last case, the else case. So this is asking, so let's say the next letter is not an A. If the next letter is not an A, I just add it back into the answer string. So answer plus equals next. Whew. All right, at that point, everything is pretty good. I think by the end of this loop, I'll have the answer. One big thing to remember, and I'll highlight this right now. If you have a method that's returning a string, an int, a double that you're finishing, make a variable of that type, and at the end, return it. There is a good chance that on the scoring rubric, they will give you points for doing that. So you may be wondering, are there other ways to do this? The answer is yes. The people who graded this said there were like 30 or 40 different ways to do this problem that they had to read. So if you were thinking of actually splitting up the word with substring commands and doing lots of funny stuff, you could do that as well. This way, which I think I've typed in correctly, it's the way that makes the most sense to me. But there are other ways to organize your code. So let me show you now. Let's see. If I go here to 2004, I can see the scoring guidelines, 14, sorry. I can see the scoring guidelines, and we'll see if my answer is anywhere near what they did. So you can see here's what they graded on. They were worth 5 points for that. And let's see. Does it look like mine? No. They did something different, which is okay. I think theirs, although is shorter, it's a little bit more complicated because they have this if case at the end. But they do some things that are fairly similar. One important thing is this whole idea of making sure you stay in bounds. They do that with the while loop by keeping the current position less than the length minus 1. So that way you're allowed to check the second position. The only reason that they have this if case at the end is if the current position is still less than the length after the loop, that means you have to add the last letter into it. Because otherwise you'll have shrunk the string by 1. So I don't think this is the most obvious way to do it, but this is the way that the question writers thought the answer would look. This is the way I think about it. It may not be very pretty. There may be better ways to organize it, but this would be a 5-point answer in my book at least. So let's say you try the best you can on that, but you can't get the whole thing. Not a big deal. Not only can you get partial credit, but then you can also move on to part 2. And part 2, and a lot of these are not very difficult if you just read it and do what it says. So we're supposed to write the method scramble or remove. And what it's supposed to do is go through here and scramble all the letters, or words, sorry, except for if after you scramble them, they don't change, you remove them. So like tan, when you scramble them, becomes TNA, so you don't remove it. Abracadabra becomes that, so you don't remove it. But woe, when you try to change it, it just becomes woe again when you scramble it, so it gets removed. Apple becomes papple, so you don't remove it. Eggs becomes eggs again, so you do remove it. Not so bad. So on the next page, once again, a list of your preconditions, what needs to happen, and the method you need to finish. So I'm going to try to do that right now in Eclipse. So first important thing, because we might be modifying the structure of this list, you cannot use the for each loop. You have to use a regular for loop. Because we're removing things, I'm going to do this the wise way. Start at the end, keep greater than or equal to 0, and do an I minus minus. You can do forward, but this is probably the easier way. I'm going to get the ith word in the list, which I always think is a good idea to kind of take out the word. And then I'm going to get the scrambled version of it. And the way I do that is by calling the method I wrote in part 1. So what happens if I screwed up the method in part 1? No worries. They will assume that it's right at this point when you call it. Now that I have it, I'd like to know, are these equal? If they are, then I need to go into the word list and remove the ith letter. Remember, you move by position. If it doesn't match, so that means I need to do a replace, the command you use is set, you put the position, and then you put what you're replacing. Oh my God, that was so much easier, right? If you followed that, you can do that in probably a couple minutes and get a lot of points. This is 4 points of the question, knowing how to go over a list, take out an item, call a function, and then do the comparison and then do the list command that you're supposed to do. So don't freak out if the first part of the question confuses you and you're not sure how to do it and you know it's going to take you a long time. Do the best you can, and then make sure you get all the points in part 2 that are usually simplified by calling the function that you wrote in part 1. Okay, so once again, let's look at their answers and see if I'm close to it. Yeah, they do sort of the same thing. They go forwards, which I think is not the right strategy. They call the function, they check if they're equal. If so, they remove it. Otherwise, they do the set command. So same idea. I think mine's simpler, but oh well. All right, so that's question 1. Now, what's interesting when we get to question 2 is you should not even do question 2 because there used to be something called the grid roll case study on the AP test, and it doesn't exist anymore. So this question will just confuse you. If you go back each year till like 2005 or so, they'll say grid rolled. Ignore those questions. Before that, there was something called the marine biology case study. Also ignore that. You don't need to know what that is. So ignore number 2. Number 3 is a good question. You're given a class called a student, so you've got these methods here. Notice they tell you they don't, you don't know what it does, so don't worry about that. Just know that students will have a get name method and a get absence count. And what we have in this situation is what you have in a lot of free response questions is a class which has an instance variable. Like notice that instance variable given to you, and you've got 2 things to finish: a constructor and a method. When you finish these 2 things, you probably need to refer to the instance variable. So just keep that in mind. Seats will be a thing. So the directions tell us here what we want to do, and they'll probably have an example here as well. So if you're too lazy to read, what the code says there, you're going to be given a list that looks like this. So these are all the students. There are their names and their absence counts. And what we're supposed to do is put them in column major order into the 2D array. So just a quick thing so you know, these are names of AP question writers, so it's kind of funny. Fran, I know who she is. Renee, Karen, so Glenn. So these are, it's kind of inside AP computer science joke. Alrighty, so what we're going to do is we're going to now have to write the constructor. So remember, the purpose of a constructor is to initialize your instance variables. And here's why that's important. And this is hard to remember when you're writing it, but let me collapse those down so we don't see those. Oops. So when you're writing that method, or the constructor, sorry, for the sitting chart class, they will not be showing you the fact that you have this instance variable here anymore, right? If I go back to the directions, right here, you don't see the seats instance variable because they're just showing you the constructor. They refer to the seats instance variable in the like directions here, but they don't actually show you the instance variable. So you need to know that it's there and you need to use it. So kind of the first thing that's pretty self-explanatory is you need to create the 2D array, right? That's the purpose of a constructor, is to initialize your instance variables. And here I'm doing that. I'm initializing the seats 2D array to have the given rows and columns. Now what I'm supposed to do is go through the list and take out each student and put them into the 2D array in what's called column major order. So you can do this. This is a little bit not the fun way to do it, but you can go through every student in the student list. So I'm doing the for each loop because I'm not modifying the list. And I need to keep putting it into the next spot in the 2D array. So to do that, I'm going to make a row variable and a column variable. And what I want to do is go into the seats 2D array at row column and put the student S there. Great. So now though, I need to change the rows and columns based on where I'm at in the 2D array. So like if I go back to the picture, after I were to put Karen at 0, 0, I need to put Liz, the next person, at row 1, column 0. Right? Yeah. So that means I need to increase the row by 1. So that means I would have to do R++. Now, sometimes in my logic, I'm going to have to actually have the row go back to 0 and have the column go up by 1. So that's like after Paul. So the strategy that I usually use for this when I'm writing code like this is I check if the row has reached the number of rows. If that happens, that means I've run out of rows, and I need the column to go up by 1 and the row to go back to 0. Now, one other thing it says in the directions is that every spot in the 2D array that you don't put a student in should be null, and they show you that here. And that'll happen, no problem, because when you make a 2D array, the values in it automatically for an object array, which student obviously is, are null by default. So any value we don't put a student into will automatically be null, so you don't have to throw any extra nulls into it. So that's fine. The other thing that might be an issue is, could there be more students in the list than there's in the 2D array? And if we look at the directions, it says that's not going to be an issue. So the size of the 2D array is at least as large as the size of the list. So our answer is good. At least we hope so. If I go now to the directions, or the answers, we'll see if it's okay. And so this answer here is working the way that a lot of students thought about it, which is they went through every row and column, and then they have another student index variable, and based on that student index, they will put a value into the 2D array. Now, one thing I'm not sure, I thought I read this right. I don't think you need this if case. I don't think you need to check if student index is less than student list.size. Let me look at that again. Yeah, you have enough room for it. So that if case is totally unnecessary, but I guess they threw it in there anyway. But this strategy makes sense. The other strategy is the one that I did, which is I go through every student, and then I place the student in the next spot. I find where the next spot is. If I've reached the end of the rows, then I reset the row and increase the column by 1. The really common mistake for this was to make a triple for loop. If you made a triple for loop for this, it was almost always wrong. And that's what they said in the reading. Like, you see a triple for loop, you should assume it's probably wrong. They would double check it, but using a triple for loop and having it work was really rare. So be careful kind of logic what you're doing. A triple for loop is not the right technique. For part B, so what we're supposed to do is go through and remove students who are absent too often. And the way we do that is replace their spots in the array with null. All right, that sounds fine. So let's go write the code for that. So we're going to go through the 2D array. So int r equal to 0, r less than seats.length, r plus plus. For int c equal to 0, c less than seats of 0.length, c plus plus. Haha, like the language. And then we're going to go ahead and I'm going to take out the student at that position. Wow, I can't spell length. That's pretty embarrassing. Row column. So before I keep going, here's the thing that almost everyone missed on this problem, and that is when you take out a student from the 2D array here, that student may be null. So a lot of people did next, which is correct, is with the student, they know that they can ask it for its number of absences, so get absence count. And we want to know, let's see, if that's greater than the allowed absences. And I think if it's strictly greater than, let me double check the directions. It says also to the or fewer, or okay, yeah. So I'm right. I read it correctly. So if this happens, what we're supposed to do is at seats RC, we're supposed to put null there. Now, the other thing we're supposed to do, I think, is remove or return the number of students that were removed. Number of students removed. Okay, so I need a counter. That's set to 0. Every time I remove, I do counter plus plus, and at the end, I return counter. Remember the easy way you could get points on this problem. If it says it needs to return an int, you should make an integer variable, and you should return it at the end. Make sure it's initialized to a reasonable number like 0, 2. You do that, you're probably getting a point automatically. Now this would not be full credit because it's possible that the student could be null, because it's an empty seat. And if it is, trying to get its absent count would crash it. So there's lots of ways to set this up. The way I'm going to do it is if S does not equal null and that. So if the student I'm looking at is not null, it's actually a student, and its absent count's greater than the allowed absences, then remove it. So this is a really important thing to remember, is that if you have a structure that can have nulls in it, you need to check if a value in that structure is null before you do any method calls with it. And if we compare this now to their answer, oops, that's the question still. If we compare that with their answer, yep, looks pretty much like what they did. It's exactly the same. The only thing different is I stored the student in a variable, so I think my code's better. But anyway, that's the way to get full credit on number 3. So that brings us to the last question on the 2014 AP test. That was the trio problem. So this is one where they gave you an interface called menu item, and you can see that it has 2 methods that are not completed, as all interfaces have. And it also tells you that there are 4 things that implement the menu interface: sandwich, salad, drink, and trio. These all 4 things have to have these 2 methods, get name and get price. Remember that. And they give you some examples of a sandwich, a salad, and a drink. It's very exciting. Each of these 3 could represent what they will call a trio. So what's a trio? So a trio is a menu item that has 1 sandwich, 1 salad, and 1 drink. The name of the trio consists of the names of the sandwich, salad, and drink in that order, each separated by a slash and followed by the name trio. Okay, so that's naming the trio for us. Trio is the sum of the 2 highest price items in the trio. 1 item with the lowest price is free. Oh, that's a nice deal. And they go through an example here of how the trio price is calculated. Then what they also show is an example of a trio object being created, which is telling us how it's going to be constructed. Notice that when you have a sandwich, salad, and drink variable, when you create a trio, it has to be in that order. You can't do salad, sandwich, drink. You can't do sandwich, salad, drink. You have to do sandwich, salad, drink. So how does a trio get created? Well, let's go to the trio class. So a trio is supposed to be made of 3 things: a sandwich, which I'll call sand, a salad, which I'll call sal, and a drink, which I'll call dr. The reason why you need that is there's going to be a constructor. If you read from the directions, the first parameter is going to be a sandwich, the second one is going to be a salad, and the third one is going to be a drink. And what does the constructor do? Well, the constructor does this. It initializes the instance variables. So remember that, right? When you read the directions, you see that there's a constructor that takes in 3 parameters. You probably are going to need instance variables that's going to hold that data. Now, this wasn't the only way to set up your instance variables. Some people made an array for them of like 3, and you're like, how can you do that? Well, each of these are menu items, so technically you could make an array of menu items. In fact, you can even make these variables of type menu item if you want. The one thing you have to have is that these 3 parameters have to be sandwich, salad, and drink. How do I know that so well? I graded this question on the AP test in the reading in 2014, so that's why I know. All right, so that's great. So what else do we have to do? Well, remember the trio, if we read in the directions, it's supposed to be implementing the menu item interface. So that's a way that you can get some points here, is to implement menu item. Now, if you're going to implement menu item, that means you're going to have 2 methods. Public, which I can't seem to spell, public string get name, as well as public double get price. I'm pretty sure, I'd have to look at the rubric again, that you're getting points just for remembering you have to write those methods. Now, the way the name is created is a little bit weird. You want it to be the combination of the sandwich's name plus a slash plus the salad's name plus a slash plus the drink's name. Oh my god, I can't type. I could actually do this faster on paper probably. Plus the word trio. That's what the get name method's supposed to do. How did I know that? Well, it says right here how the name is constructed. The name of the trio consists of the names of the sandwich, salad, and drink in that order, each separated by a slash and followed by the space, then trio. Bam. If you read that line, it tells you how the get name method is supposed to work. Now, the get price method is supposed to calculate the price of a trio, which is supposed to be just the two largest values added together. This became a problem for a lot of people. So let's see, what would be the easiest way to do this? So I know the cheater way to do it. I'm trying to think of what most of you would do. So what I think is easiest is to figure out which one is the least valuable, which one's the cheapest. So that's what I would probably do first. So double cheapest. And I'm going to assign that to be the sandwich to start. And then what I do is just write some if cases, like if the salad's price is actually less than cheapest, then cheapest should become the salad's price, which I can't do. There we go. And then if the drink's price is less than the cheapest, then the cheapest should become the drink price. Okay, no problem there. So I now know the value of the cheapest one. Why would I want to do that? Well, then, if I return the sandwich's price plus the salad's price, not get name, get price, plus the drink's price minus the cheapest price, I'm done. So that's the way I would do it. You don't have to do it this way, but anyone who did this problem this way made the graders very happy. Are there other ways to do this? Sure. You'd have to write a lot of if cases, and you'd have to be very careful with them. You'd have to make sure you're doing greater than or equal to's. You'd have to make sure, I mean, it's doable, but I think my way is the best. So let's compare with the answer key to see if I forgot anything. Yeah, this is the way I don't even like it. So they have their three instance variables, they implement menu item, they do what we did in the constructor, the get name methods the way we did get name, and they do the get price method the way that also works. They take out the three price variables, and they establish which one is the cheapest, and then if this sandwich is the cheapest, you return the price of the other two. Otherwise, if the salad is the cheapest, you return the price of the other two, otherwise you do the last combination. This way also works, and it's fine. There were lots of ways to set this up that were incorrect, which became annoying to read in terms of nesting it, but either this way or the way I did it would be fine. Some people did something interesting, which is instead of storing the sandwich, salad, and drink into variables, they just stored the name of the trio object and the final price. So they did all the work in the constructor, and then their getter methods just returned the values calculated in the constructor. Is that wrong? No, the directions didn't say you had to store the sandwich, salad, and drink, just you need to be able to return the values for these methods correctly. So, although I think this is the more standard answer, some people did it this way. So, what's kind of the moral of this story? So, one, the free response questions, there are lots of points that you can get if you follow a couple of key rules. One is when you're writing a method and it has a return type, right away declare a variable of that type, and at the end make sure you're returning that variable or something involving that variable. When you're writing classes or interfaces, or writing classes that use interfaces or extend abstract classes, make sure you're writing the right phrase to implement or extend the abstract class or implement the interface. And then make sure that you provide the methods that are in that interface. Make sure that your instance variables are private. Make sure your constructors initialize your instance variables. Make sure that you go from parameter to instance variable and you don't have assignment dyslexia. Make sure that if you have a 2D array or an array list as an instance variable and you're writing the constructor, that you're initializing your instance variable. This is very important. Make sure that if your structure could have nulls in it, that you check if they're null or not before you do anything with it. Once again, return type of type int. I make an int variable. At the end, I return it. Free points. Don't forget that. Also, don't forget if your class has an instance variable that you can use that instance variable in methods that you're finishing. Really easy to forget that. It's bad if you do. And finally, let's see. Know how to do string operations and list operations. Know the right way to do things, how to loop backwards. Know that if you're modifying the list that you want to not use the for each loop. Um, know how to do the set command and the remove command. And then know your string operations, how to do substring, how to do equals, and be careful with your logic. So that's pretty much it. If you got free time this weekend, I would definitely consider looking at old free response questions. Maybe try the 2014, try the 2013, the 12. Lots of great old questions to look at. And then if you have more time, you've got multiple choice problems to do. You got a review video here. You got some important things to review. So good luck with all your studying. Let me know if you have any questions.